indicated that most of the town-owned roads were dirt, and excessive weight had caused significant damage and was a continuing issue within that community to repair those. On the issue of consultation, for the folks that did have the ordinances, 14 of them said that they were nearly split on consultation. Many of them seemed to indicate that they were older ordinances with an unknown history for adoption. And then additionally, state guidance was listed as key to both adoption and the repealing of forestry ordinances. We did get comments about that. So it's close to being 50-50 in terms of whether or not those municipalities had consulted with a forester for the adoption of their ordinance. And my sense is from the responses that it really had to do with the key enactment of that requirement in law. So we also asked about contact with forestry operators, if they knew who was operating in their community and what types of complaints or interactions they received with those forestry operators. The vast majority of the municipalities were not familiar with those that were operating in their communities. Several listed that they knew there were a ton of independent contractors. The communities that did have significant forestry lands did know their operators and were able to list them. And communities also expressed consistent resident and logger complaints, lack of enforcement support, and operator respect for road postings as key intersection issues where they would come into contact with forestry operators. Seems like roads are really kind of central to the complaints that are fielded on the municipal level. So what are some of the obvious ways that we could be looking for a path forward? In Maine Municipal's point of view, the existing processes are robust. They provide opportunities to build relationships with those communities where the operation exists. And that's been clear as everyone who has presented so far has established that they were able to either overturn or amend ordinances by that engagement piece. Preempting that engagement or ignoring that resident desire does create unnecessary animosity, which is going to encourage or exacerbate the harassment issue. And that can't be dealt with through a municipal ordinance. It's really clear that when operators engage or foresters engage, that the ordinances have been changed, and that is laborious. And it's also clear that the department guidance is where municipal officials look. So some ways in which we can make some improvements for this entire process at the municipal level is to either improve or support department resources for municipal officials, improve that communication, provide a list of ordinances that have been adopted and have been vetted through the department, like the pesticide ordinance already has, so that clearly communicates to operators where they may run into more stringent operational restrictions, and also encourage the industry to be part of that solution. Their outreach and their information is what has been changing that. So there may be ways in which we can do that on a state level, but they definitely need to be part of that solution, and rolling over the municipal engagement piece is not going to help the situation. Supporting public education campaigns and building goodwill, providing better enforcement tools if necessary. I'm not sure how you split the thread on the harassment issues, because that's, that is existing law, but maybe there is some sort of caveat that we can do for harassment that provides law enforcement an ability to respond rather than looking at it as a civil matter, which may end up being what is happening on the ground. Also, I think that everybody can get behind improving and supporting department investment in statewide education or expansion of existing foresters and resources. I think that's something that it's clear that we're hearing consistently, both from the forestry section as well, from the operators as well as municipalities, is that they're looking for those resources. And it sounds like very much that this response has been a lack of resources that exist and maybe a way to deal with that. And I think we need to get back to what's core and what's primary, which is that relationship building piece. It brings goodwill, and folks want to do the right thing. They want to move forward in a way that is functional for everybody, and then they want the ability to deal with folks that aren't playing by the rules. So those are the key municipal takeaways. And to that point, let me see if I can get back to that other screen. We have the former code enforcement officer. I think he's in here. Yes, Michael Kreindler. I believe he's the deputy code enforcement officer currently for Arousek. So he can give you some history as to why their small community on the coast of Maine had adopted some strict forestry resource protection mechanisms, and how they've had to apply that kind of equally in that community to prevent some of their character being washed away. So I don't know if we can unmute or promote Michael to a participant so that he can actually talk about the history of that. Oh, looks like he is getting that way.
Yeah, I took care of him.
Okay.
Michael, you're on mute.
All right. All right, this is my first Teams foray here, so I'm a little kludgy with it. Well, thanks, Rebecca. As you said on Friday, this is rather short notice, so I'm not prepared anything, but I do want to. Oh, and I see Nancy Safara in the room, and hi, Nancy. She was a fellow resident in Arousek and former member of the Arousek Planning Board, so she's familiar with a lot of this material as well. And I should clarify by saying that I'm not here as a representative of the town. Because of the short notice on this, there was no opportunity to bring this forward to the select board for discussion. So I'm attending to represent myself as a resident of the town, and with my experience as being the former codes officer, I'm now in a backup position to Chris Wilcoxon, who's in the lead. But I am familiar certainly with our ordinances and with our town. Arousek is a very small community. We are an island community on the Kennebec River, about 10 square miles, population of about 470. The town is largely run by volunteers, and running a town with so few population is a very limited pool of people to draw from, and we see it's important to us, and that's why we devote ourselves to it and treat it as a luxury. Running a town is a luxury that we need to support if we want it. And so there has been a strong history of that in the past. Our ordinances certainly predate my 25 years in town, and although they have been changed over time, much of the change has been a result of the Department of Environmental Protection issuing new shoreline zoning guidelines, and then the planning board needing to take those guidelines and amend the ordinances in order to be consistent with those state minimums. And the last round, large round of amendments had to do with the 2006 guidelines. And so in that process, the town was faced with many changes that needed to be made. It was a large project for us. And when the town came to the question of shoreland, timber harvesting and shoreland clearing for vegetation, clearing for development, I think are the two categories. The history of timber harvesting in Arousek recently has been very, very minimal. There's been very little timber harvesting. In my time as codes officer, there may have been 2 or 3 notices of intent to harvest, and I don't believe any of them were even in the shoreland zone. So the approach that the town took was more about the forces that were at play in Arousek, which was largely residential development. And Arousek is zoned for strictly residential land use. There's no commercial district, and we have 2 and 5 acre residential zoning, roughly split half and half on the island. And so the approach that was taken, given the choices presented to us by the DEP on timber harvesting, we chose to simplify it by saying that we would approach timber harvesting in the same manner that we do clearing land for development. In other words, apply one set of standards for both situations. And that was, I think, somewhat a result of the fact that that seemed to be the residential use of the land seemed to be the dominant thing that landowners wanted. So the timber harvesting was not front and center or really given as much weight as the other was. And so that's, I think, a little bit of history of why zoning or timber harvest may be a perfect fit for the needs of timber harvesting. And I certainly have very little experience or knowledge of the issues that the timber harvesting industry faces. I could talk about our specific zoning if that would be helpful, but I don't want to monopolize or take too much time. So Rebecca, if you want to guide me in terms of what issues you'd like me to talk about, or anyone else, I'd be happy to.
Yeah, and so I think probably key of the conversations that I had with you was that you looked at an equal approach. So you didn't look at splitting expectations between types of activity, but making it uniform and egalitarian essentially in its application, which is not only easier for volunteer planning boards to understand, but it's also kind of leveling the playing field so that there's not even a question, I guess, between what type of operations and the issues that can come out of that too, because you have a small area. But that was also informed by resident desire. And
yes.
Yeah, and so these are conversations that happen within communities, and then they're reaffirmed by that community as well. So
can I
go ahead.
I can add on that what you've just said in terms of community desire. There were 2 examples of that that I think maybe illustrate the point of what the town has wanted to do or has been influenced to do by the DEP and I think it was Inland Fish and Wildlife, in that once the eastern side of the island adjacent to the Back River, much of the island from, I would say 2/3 of that shoreline, which is a long ways in our town, is all resource protected. And that was because the habitat and environmental concerns about the Back River as being a sanctuary was important to the residents of the town to preserve that rather pristine and look and the illusion of remoteness that residents seem to like. And so that that much resource protected land, and under our ordinance, resource protection does not allow for selective cutting. And if you're applying those standards, it does rule out timber harvesting within 250 feet of the resource. On the other side of that is the ordinance we have along town roads. Town roads require a buffer strip 50 feet wide from the edge of the road into the property where a well-distributed stand of trees is to remain. That is a very long-standing ordinance that was modified when we adopted the point system. And what the point system did was provide a way to quantify and implement what was meant by a well-distributed stand of trees. And the point system was a process that had been handed to us by the Department of Environmental Protection for use in the shoreland zone in less restricted shoreland areas. And so we saw that as a way to take something that was already a known process and apply it to something that wasn't necessarily in shoreland, but accomplished a similar purpose of retaining a rural character and feel when driving down town roads. And I think those are two examples of how the town has chosen for its own values, vision, purposes to implement restrictions on removal of vegetation.
Thanks for that, Michael. Nancy, I see your hand raised, and since you're an Aroustic resident, maybe you wanted to weigh in a bit.
Well, actually, one clarification question I have for Mike, because I was reading the, Michael, I was reading the ordinance this morning, and under the resource protection portion, the first paragraph does allow for some removal of diseased trees. Is that, I mean, I just want clarification, is that on a single tree by single tree basis, or is that, could that be applied to a stand within resource protection? So, you know, for instance, an overstocked X plantation that's not growing anymore.
Well, the way that's been used, yeah, thanks, Nancy. There are two exceptions that allow for vegetation removal in a resource protection area. Both do require a proposal review and a permit be issued, a conditional use permit. So there is an opportunity to have that discussion. And one of those categories is, as you point out, diseased, dying, hazardous trees. And that's largely been used in cases where where there may be a house existing in the resource protection zone, and you have trees that have grown and are overarching above the roof, or presenting a hazard to users of the land in terms of snags or trees, so that it's on a case-by-case basis. And any proposal that has come forward is then reviewed. The concept being that the town does not want, if the town is going to allow for certain human activities in those areas, then the town doesn't want to put people in harm's way or put their property in jeopardy. So there is a reasonable dialogue that goes along with that, which performs a role of being an exception to the no cutting. On a larger scale, it hasn't come forward at this point, so I can't really say how that would apply. But certainly, in my time, I was open to any reasonable proposal that met the criteria of that ordinance.
Michael, can I just follow up and ask when this has come into, or has it come into conflict with forestry operations within Aroustic, and what would help your your planning board, your code enforcement activity, make that less onerous or help with that, would have helped with that particular issue? Yes.
Well, I think it is, you're correct in that the planning board would be the body that is responsible for bringing forward proposals to amend the ordinance. And they meet regularly, and they're a collegial group of residents that engage very well with landowners when there are concerns. They look at things such as when a request is made to amend the ordinance, is it how broad is the constituency that would be affected by a change? If it's one landowner that has an issue with the existing ordinances, but there's no other upswell of support, or it's not a town-wide issue that needs to be looked at, it's harder for the board, I've seen, for them to take it as a kind of a popular issue when it is a single landowner. But the board is certainly open to discussion, and the ordinance is a living document that is amended time to time as needed. So there's no shutting down of discussion on that account. And there has not been in the past any let's say input or dialoguing with any state departments to provide education around the subject of timber harvesting. So it has basically been a non-issue until recently.
Thanks. Thank you very much. I'm seeing a question come in. I was just going to say, I think that's pretty much the extent of what we had to present. So, Paul?
Thank you, Rebecca. I don't know if my stuff, can you hear me all right?
I can hear you.
Perfect. Thank you. Michael, thank you for the presentation. Just a follow-up, Nancy's question, differentiating residential development from timber harvesting. I think that's an important, the state has done that with their standards, differentiating both DEP and Maine Forest Service, differentiating development from timber harvesting with the point system. I do the point system quite a bit. I do a bunch of shoreline zone work for residential development. The point system works on a small scale, like an acre lot, 2 acre lot, but on a wood lot, it's cost prohibitive to do it for a landowner. I have 2 clients in Aroostook who I've met with over the last several weeks. One of them, I told them I didn't know if we could actually cut wood on their woodlot because of the zoning. So it's discouraging to tell them, I'm not sure if you can do any management on your land because of the zoning restrictions, the way that they're written. And these are both landowners I know you'd know. They're very involved, but it was, I think, an eye-opener to them to learn about what it meant for doing good management on their woodlots. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Paul. I want to ask you if you can see a way that Aroostook could potentially split that in terms of making sure that that buffer was kept. Is there another method that you see that would meet both resident desire, looking for a solution as well as being?
Yeah, I think, Rebecca, I think just there's got to be a differentiation between residential development and timber harvesting. They're not the same thing. They're not even residential development. Once that land is changed, is no longer forestry. It's not forest. It's a house lot at that point. So the difference between residential development, clearing vegetation for building houses, is very different than managing timberland for the health of the forest. They're not even close to the same thing. You know, changing land into development has long-term consequences. That land's gone. It's done. You know what I mean? It's always going to be house lot. If we encourage people to manage their land, they're less likely to develop. The discouraging thing with the current ordinance is when you look at my client's property on the map, that zone that is zoned on their woodlot also has residential houses in it. So I ask you, what's the greater impact? Doing a healthy selective harvest for the health of the forest, or putting houses in it? They shouldn't be the same.
What I heard was kind of that there's a buffer that is hoped to be retained from the road. So is there a reason why that would, I guess, interrupt how healthy harvest could not happen if there was a buffer? Is this just a really small lot?
No, this is not just road buffers. This is shoreline zone buffers. This is they have special protection zone, and this is all of them. So these are 50-acre lots. So in one case, the 50-acre lot, probably 40% of it falls in the zone. In the case of the 30-acre lot, almost 75% of it falls in a zone. So, I mean, you're pretty limited on what you're going to do at that point as far as forest management activities go. So it's not just the road; it's the shoreline zone buffer, the point system, all of that coming into play. All the zones merging here. I see Nancy. I'll stop talking. Hi, Nancy.
Go ahead, Nancy.
Hi, Paul. Yeah, so like one of the things about, and I'm familiar with at least one of the cases in Aroustic only because of we own the property next door and have a trail that goes through, we being the Nature Conservancy. So I'm a little bit familiar with one of the instances there in Aroustic where within the resource protection zone, there's a overstocked, very old pine plantation. And from the perspective of the health of shoreline zoning, you're probably better off going in and doing a restoration harvest in there to try to get more natural vegetation back for the benefit of the resource protection zone. And so I think that and I will, and everybody probably knows this, I'm really a strong supporter of resource protection and shoreline zoning ordinances. But I think that for some of the town ordinances that don't allow for that kind of work, they should be looking a little bit at are there instances where some of that work should be allowed because from the standpoint of the stand that's within that shoreline zone, you can improve it to the point where you're doing better for the wetland. So an example of this particular pine plantation is it's all clay soil. There's no undergrowth at all underneath it. And as those trees start falling over, what you're going to end up with is some pretty severe erosion and sedimentation into the wetland. And so there could be some real benefits to doing harvesting in a location like that. So just, keeping in mind that these ordinances should be flexible enough to be able to do some of that restoration work.
So because I'm on a volunteer planning board as well, I think we benefit from having Nancy in the community, I think, in Aroustic to know that kind of thing. But as a planning board member, I'm not going to know that type of thing. They're looking at external resources, and that is always the state. So we're looking to the state to tell us what is appropriate, what is not appropriate, and whether or not, there can be that flexibility. I think municipal officials are probably the strongest in terms of like, this is not allowed. That's how I read that. If they don't have that guidance, if it doesn't exist, we don't know where to go get it. We rely on those experts, particularly with volunteer planning boards. But I think probably Mike can speak to that as well. And I also see Tom and Don who have questions. So, Tom, you're on top. If that has any bearing in this.
A question I had for Mike was, are you aware of the requirement in statute to consult with to use a forester and consult with the Maine Forest Service in developing a forestry ordinance? And I understand this may have been in place a long time, but it's been amended, I assume, multiple times. The draft I saw said it was amended most recently in 2015. I think that would trigger the statute, frankly. So is Arasa aware that of that requirement, or even the ability of the Forest Service to assist?
Well, thanks for that question. The last amendment, 2015, I think was a minor shift in pertaining to standby generators and how those were addressed. So the last time I believe that anything related to vegetation was amended was in the large scale 2009 overhaul of the ordinances, and the discussions that we were under the guidance of the Maine Department of Environmental Protection agency. It was Mike Morse was our shoreline zoning coordinator, and he was our go-to for telling us what changes needed to be made in the ordinance in order to comply with state rules. I think that the short answer to your question is no. I don't believe the town was aware of that statute, and I don't believe there's been any discussion with the department.
Because I think that 2009 might have been when the point system went in, and that was
That's right.
for use in development. I don't know if there's another. I don't know. Somebody may know. Is there any other town in the state that uses the point system everywhere? I'm guessing probably not. But the requirement, but for consultation and use of a forester went in, and Don Mancis can tell me, but it was around 2000 maybe.
Correct.
Right, somewhere in there, Don. So, I mean, one of the issues we're dealing with is, do you have an ordinance that's actually legally adopted? And I'm not sure if it held, whether it would hold up in court or not. But I guess nobody's tested it. But there is that statute, and there is that help available from the Forest Service directly or through that process.
Well, I think what's also interesting out of that conversation is that you were in deep consultation with the Department of Environmental Protection, and why would you not be directed to those types of resources from a state agency that existed in another state agency, or those requirements? You're looking to the state, you're getting information from one state agency that might be in conflict. That's also something that happens at the municipal level. All of those requirements meet on the ground. So one would think that if you're in contact from the end user point with one state agency, that they would have that information that would be passing over as well.
I'm guessing it was partly because DEP was dealing directly with the clearing for development, and that was what they were working with towns with. And I'm guessing that nobody anticipated that would be used everywhere, but it's clear that the DEP should be telling towns, if they're doing that, oh, by the way, here's this other requirement.
Right. I want to clarify that in terms of the application of the point system, except for areas within 50 feet of town roads, and that's not all the roads in town, because the majority of roads are private roads. So the town has, I think, 9 roads that it owns, and the way that ordinance is written is town roads, not the state road, not private roads. The requirement to maintain a stand of trees within 50 feet of those roads, I haven't had the time to go back and see how far back in our ordinances that exists. The addition to that ordinance of the point system occurred in 2009 when the point system was adopted for shoreland. But it does not, other than along those roads, it does not apply to any other acreage that is not in shoreland, which is the majority of the land in town.
So sorry.
It's the majority of land in town that if it's not in shoreland, it's unregulated for vegetation removal.
Don, can you hear me? Kleiner?
I'm sorry, I can now.
Okay, sorry.
So I think actually we've stumbled onto a pretty significant area for some conversation. And here is state government not working in unison. And I get that the DEP deals with development and forestry deals with forestry, but there's an overlap. And how do we, I don't know enough of these stakeholder groups to know that we're probably in a very big pond, but how do we foster that relationship so that conversation takes place? And I've been on a planning board just like you. I've had the DEP roll in and tell us what we needed to do. And just because of my life experiences, I occasionally knew to say, that's not right, please check. Well, not everybody knows that. How do we get that going? How do we foster that conversation somehow? And I mean, I just want to put a marker down that that's a pretty significant issue here.
Yeah, Don, I'm really glad that you said that, because it is a number of issues that are met at the municipal level that are just that, and it's really hard to find that path forward. Especially if you're not working in it on a regular basis, if you're not interfacing with these entities on a regular basis, you're just taking it for granted. So starting from a place of understanding that these folks want to do the absolute best that they can, and what they need are resources. And I think that we need to do that from both sides. We need to do that. All forestry operations want to do the best thing that they can for the health of the forest. How can we support that? And the same thing with municipal officials. Those would be keys. Barry Brusilla, I'm sorry if I just murdered your name. Oh, you're on mute. I'm sorry. Let me get you on mute.
Okay.
Oh, there we go.
Yeah, my name is Barry Brusela. I should probably introduce myself because I was invited to join this call. I'm a consultant forester with Mid-Maine Forestry, and I am on the board of the Maine Tree Foundation, which owns a 300-acre property in Arousik. And that's the property I believe that Nancy was referring to with the overmature pine plantation. So hello, and thank you for allowing me to pipe in today. So a few things. I have a lot to say about all this. In addition to being on the board of the Maine Tree Foundation, I'm also a consulting forester, and we held a timber harvest on the Holt Research Forest last winter, and it was the first commercial harvest that's been held in Arousik, I believe, since the mid-'80s, when the last harvest was conducted on the Holt Research Forest. So I work in a lot of towns throughout Mid-Coast Maine, and this is really the only town that has regulations like this. And it also has very little commercial forest management going on. Basically, on the Holt Research Forest is it. And there's, of course, a very strong correlation between the regulations that the town has and the lack of any kind of forest management. So I think that's one of the things we're talking about today. And back before the pandemic started, I was in conversations with Mike and others in the town about the regulations as we were planning this harvest. And we talked at the time about the availability of the Maine Forest Service. The local service forester was very willing to come in and talk with the town. And Adam Cates, who is a regional enforcement officer, I'd also talked with him and mentioned this to town people, that the Maine Forest Service would be very willing to come and meet with people to talk about the regulations and options and that sort of thing. So it's not quite the great divide that was recently been painted. And as Tom mentioned earlier too, that there is a requirement that a forester be involved in any development of town forestry regulations. And it sounds like that probably didn't happen in Arousik. And of course, it's a matter of timing, what happened when. But I find the Maine Forest Service is very easy to reach and ask for information. And I would encourage towns to use that as a resource, and also consulting foresters. And I very much echo what Paul Larrabee said a little while ago about the big difference between timber harvesting regulations and shoreland and the clearing for development standards. They are very different things, and lumping them together is really, I think, detrimental to both. So a couple of the thoughts I had as I was listening to this conversation. One is, well, getting back to the point system along the roads. And I took a few notes when Mike was talking, and the regulations are designed to retain the rural character feel along the road. And Maine is 89% forested, and it's really easy to keep that rural character feel, and you don't need a point system in order to do that. And he mentioned also the resource protection value and the wildlife value of the back river, which is absolutely true. But again, using a point system designed for residential development to protect a wildlife resource is not necessarily the best way to go. And also, it seems kind of ironic to me that if you have homes in a resource protection zone and you're allowed to cut trees to protect those homes, I would offer that the impact of human activity and lawns and dogs and fertilized lawns and runoff is a much bigger, it can be a much bigger impact on a valuable resource than having a forested shore, an undeveloped shore, which maybe gets harvested every 15 years and the rest of the time is just left untouched to protect the soil and water and wildlife habitats. So just I've kind of used a soapbox here since I got the mic, but I have other contributions as well. And anyway, very glad to be a part of this conversation and to talk about, if anyone has any questions about the harvesting or what's been done on the whole, I'd be glad to talk about that as well. So thank you, and thanks for inviting me to the meeting.
Don, go ahead.
Thanks. One other issue I'd like to ask Barry and Paul and Greg to speak to is Hemlock Woolly Adelgid. Arousik is ground zero for Hemlock Woolly Adelgid, and I'm familiar with that town as well. And I when I go down there, I drive through roads or on roads that are surrounded by dead and dying hemlock. And so I'd like to have you, one or all of you, expand upon that issue as what you see you're dealing with in the shoreland areas where you work. Thanks.
Do you want me to go first, or do you? I'll let Greg or Barry, if you want to go first, you can. But I was in Woolwich yesterday, so I'll what I'm dealing with is definitely Hemlock Woolly Adelgid, Don. But the other thing to keep in mind is the overall health related to the age of the forest and the soils that they're growing on. We have old ag land, thin soils, ledge outcrop, with white pine, aging white pine, that is suffering dramatic decline, needlecast disease. I'm sorry, needlecast disease, and so it's not just the insect; it's the current structure of the forest and the age of the forest. And like I agree with what Nancy said earlier. When you have these pines uniform with no understory, which is a result of old cleared agricultural land in a lot of places that I deal with, that are aging out and beginning to tip over in these zones, it's not helping with water quality. It's not helping with wildlife habitat. So it's more than just an insect or a disease. It's a current structure of the forest along the coast, their age and the site that they're located on. So not managing them is not the answer in the long term. And this is why this needs to be different than residential development. This has nothing to do with residential development. This is about the health of our forests. And remember, these lands were all ag land. These were all past agricultural land that have reverted into almost even age forests in some cases. So thank you. That's it.
Thanks, Paul.
Yeah, well, I can speak to that too, because right on the Holt Forest, when we did the harvest, we basically stayed out of the 250-foot shoreland zone, and that, and as well as the point system area along the road, and that took quite a few acres out of management, basically. But in part of that 250-foot zone along the back river, there are some overmature, dense hemlock areas that have been hit very hard by the adelgid, and we made the choice to just stay out of it. I don't know what will be in the future there. I think the trees will probably all die. We'll have a stand of tall, dead trees with not a whole lot of regeneration coming up underneath. And in Maine, we generally don't worry as much about fire as we worry as other regions of the country. But I personally would be more concerned about a stand of tall, dead hemlock trees, especially in a town like Arousek, where again there are people living in this resource. There's people living in this area of a forest that's not managed. So I think there's just a lot of risks that are involved that maybe people aren't thinking about a whole lot at this point.
Greg?
Yeah, hi. Thanks for the opportunity to talk about this. I've done some work on the coast of Maine in terms of harvesting timber in the shoreland zone, and it is difficult when you feel like you're handcuffed in terms of trying to do something good for the property owner when they have the hemlock adeldage, they got dying trees, and you go to the landowner and say, well, we can't cut them all because we're limited, and you're going to lose that value, and at the same time you're going to watch your trees die. And that may become an issue also with the emerald ash borer. And in regard to Mike and his presentation about the ordinance and so forth, and this has always bugged me my whole career basically, is we're talking about a resource that we're protecting in terms of any kind of regulations that limits timber harvesting. And very little play gets put on the property owner, who I think is probably the most important resource, and the effects on them and what it makes them do. And I think of the state of California. I remember talking to a forester out there, and he told me that the cost of administering a timber sale for a property owner was so much that they had to cut most of the timber in order to pay for his services, because they had to meet ordinances, they had hearings to go to, and their neighbors got to get input into what they do. And, we're not there yet, but that's something to be aware of. And I'd like to see more emphasis put on the landowner concern, because they own the land, and I think they have the opportunity to do a real good job of doing things right. But when they're excluded, so to speak, and then they found out afterwards the rules that they got to go by, they're not happy campers. And they are a minority vote in any town, so that they're already behind it when it comes to voting on additional regulations. And I'll stop for now.
Thanks, Greg. Tom, you got your hand up.
Yeah, I don't want Mike to think that we're picking on him or Arousek or anything. So, Mike, I appreciate you being here and telling the story and everything. And I think this is this is the group that's looking at how to move forward on these kind of issues. And I think this is a classic example of why the law was put into place in the first time about consultation. Because my experience has been, and I was director of the Forest Service when this law went in, and I did some of the first consultations. And my experience is that these are very well-intended approaches. These aren't people that are, have any big fight. It's well-intended thoughts about protecting the town, and we all live in a town. We all care about that kind of thing. But the idea was to avoid these unintended consequences or things that don't make any biological sense or lead to some other situations that eventually everybody says, what the heck happened here? And the whole idea was to get a forester involved so that there's principals involved, and have the Forest Service have a chance to review it, and not to say never do it, but make sure that what's done makes sense. And that's, I mean, this is, I think, is probably an extreme example maybe of where that could go wrong without the consultation. But I think it makes the case for, you know, the law would the discussion you're having right now is the discussion that should be had during the development of any ordinance, and that's the intention of that law, to understand the ramifications of certain restrictions and things. So I appreciate, Mike, you being here, and I certainly don't mean to pick on you. I hope you don't come away feeling like that. So, but thanks for this whole discussion. It's been very helpful, actually.
You're welcome. And initially, when I learned about this group, I thought that Rouseck was on a list of numerous other towns that fit the criteria, and so I'm not aware of what those other towns have done or not done, or how they fit into the equation as well. So it's certainly, I'm certainly not trying to make Rouseck ground zero for this issue or a target in any way. And I'm more interested in learning about the issue and understanding the concerns and the science and the benefits that can be had, that, as you point out, we didn't necessarily have the benefit of that exposure to that training at the point at which those decisions were being made. And the good news is that it's not too late. There certainly can be movement on the issue, but it's a process that involves education and discussion with the people of the town. And I think we're open to it. I don't sit on the planning board, and I'm no longer in the lead position as codes officer, but I think that we have a history of being very receptive to concerns that are brought before the town.
Thank you, Michael. I had Heather, then Barry, then Rebecca.
Good morning, everyone. I just wanted to thank Rebecca and Tom and Barry for your presentations and the extra work that you've put in, Rebecca, survey. I've learned a lot this morning, as I always do in these meetings. And I guess I'm just wondering, maybe this is a question for you, Barry, in particular, since you've worked with so many different organizations and communities. Do you feel that the statute that we have on books already is sufficient, or do you think additional to address the process that municipalities and communities should follow, even if they're not necessarily aware of it, or do you feel that there should be additional laws adopted to address some of the issues that you've experienced?
Yeah, that's a good question. That actually, that's what I was going to speak to too, was the value to me of the statewide shoreland zone standards. I know many towns have adopted those, and once a certain number have adopted them, then it'll be the law for all of them. And I think I look at those as kind of a win-win situation. They've been developed with a lot of input from a lot of people over the years, both townspeople as well as people in the natural resource professions. And for a town to adopt statewide standards, I look at it as kind of taking a monkey off your back. If the town adopts statewide standards, then the responsibility for enforcement gets transferred to the Maine Forest Service. And so the local court enforcement officer, who may know a lot about building codes and plumbing codes and that sort of thing, and may not know a whole lot about forestry, they don't have the responsibility to deal with that. It's the Maine Forest Service who has people trained to deal with it. So it kind of makes things easier for the town. And I do like the having to have a forester involved in any other further regulations that are made. I don't think there's really any further regulations that I can think of that would need to be done. I think it would be a lot easier once statewide standards are adopted, and that makes it easier for foresters that work with landowners because they know the rules aren't going to change from town to town. That makes our job a lot easier. And also for landowners who may own land in multiple towns or be deciding where to buy land where to buy their woodlot. You know, maybe they buy it in a town that is currently, maybe people aren't buying land in Arousek because, you know, or the people that are buying land in Arousek may be focused more on housing and development. And if you're trying to maintain the rural character of a town, then having a town that's friendly to managing a forest, I think you'll see less development in that town, if that makes sense. So hopefully that answered your question. But anyway, I just wanted to put in the plug for towns adopting the statewide shoreland zone ordinance, and then have foresters talk to them about, is this really necessary, for example, to enforce a point system rule along a town road?
Can I ask another follow-up to that?
Sure.
I appreciate that about the shoreland zoning. And I guess the question is the next question really would just be about municipalities adopting any other kind of ordinance about forestry operations that were necessarily specific to shoreland zoning, because there are a number of reasons, a number of approaches that communities will take. And the process through which communities or municipalities are supposed to go before implementing an ordinance is pretty extensive, and it's spelled out in statute. And just my feeling, my feeling is that there already are very extensive requirements for a community to go through consultation and assessment and public posting about hearings and discussions before they can enforce an ordinance. And I just wonder if that, if you feel that what is already on the books there, specific to those ordinances, sufficient. That hasn't really come up for you in the work that you've done.
Yeah, I haven't really had to deal with the process of a town adopting a new ordinance. Most of the ones I work with have been on the books, maybe for decades. And for example, in Noblesboro, there's an ordinance. You always have to get a permit from the town to harvest, whether it's in the shoreland zone or not. And I think that's years ago, there was a selectman that didn't like the look of a harvest across the street or something like that, or it was just some very personal little thing. And now there's this ordinance that has continued on. So I can't really speak to the process of towns adopting it. But I think if anything like that is done, having consultation with the Maine Forest Service or the Inland Fisheries and Wildlife. And I just want to get back to the state shoreland zone regulations. Variances is always something that planning boards are presented with, and it can be fairly problematic how to deal with that. And the Maine Forest Service, the statewide standards, has a process for getting a variance. For example, if you want to cut more than 40% in the shoreland zone and you have a good reason to do it. I've gone through that process a couple of times on woodlots, and it's been for the hemlock woolly adelgid, a infestation in the shoreland zone. And I think that process was very helpful. It was not just me as a forester making decision. I, talk with the local, the regional enforcement officer for the Maine Forest Service, and he puts it through a whole review process with Inland Fisheries and Wildlife and neighbors. And so everyone is aware of the process, has a chance to ask questions, and then a decision is made. And then I implement it or I don't, depending on which way the decision goes. But that, again, is another example how the the burden would be taken off a local planning board, especially with variance processes, to have a whole staff of professionals dealing with it rather than a volunteer planning board trying to understand the nuances of how a particular activity might affect the wildlife values or the resource values in a given area.
Thanks, Barry.
Yeah.
Rebecca, and then Nancy, and then Paul.
I just wanted to clarify one of Barry's points. Unfortunately, shoreline zoning has and always will fall on the municipality to enforce. There is no enforcement at the state level for shoreline zoning. There's occasional support. So the statewide standards are the minimum standards. Regulated communities must, because of their permit, create greater restrictions. When that first went into effect, it came with money from the state for that activity, and now it doesn't. So the way in which a lot of these ordinances have been developed, particularly with regard to forestry, which was the key factor for the respondents that responded, that they were responding to the shoreline zoning issues. So back when the shoreline zoning issues came forward, that triggered a lot of these forestry ordinances, and proportionally, it's not a lot of ordinances statewide. It's, I think, there were at least 20 of the respondents. I think there may be 30 that we've known or at least identified statewide out of 480. So this is proportionally a small group. But there are communities, particularly larger communities, that have even more stringent permit requirements for that, particularly for those resource zones. So a lot of the more strict standards have been developed in response to those other obligations, which just gets back to that. There are multiple intersections of state and federal requirements that intersect at that municipal level, and is overly reliant on those folks. So the only other thing that I wanted to get back to is to say that the shoreline zoning seemed to be the #1 trigger for the creation of the forestry ordinances to begin with. So that is probably something that we should recycle back to, and at least try to maybe encourage or create out of this process some sort of flow between DEP regulations and also additional more stringent regulations, and create some sort of tools at the municipal level to be able to thread these multiple obligations that are met at that there.
Yeah, Rebecca, I'll speak to that later, but I know that Nancy and then Paul and then Don Kleiner have their hands up. Nancy?
I just wanted to, because Heather mentioned, other ordinances that might be in play. And one of the things that I just wanted to highlight, and I know it's not something that this group is meant to tackle, but I think it could have some impacts that, especially in southern coast and coastal Maine, if an area hasn't been harvested in a while, one of the things that sometimes can happen is it sort of triggers the spread and germination of invasives. And there are some towns that are starting to adopt pesticide ordinances. And so it's just another layer of hoops that land managers have to sort of jump through in some cases if they need to go do remediation on a site after harvesting. And so I just wanted to sort of flag that as a potential conflict in terms of trying to get forest management done on some lands and the relationship to town ordinances.
Thank you. Paul?
Thank you. Thank you, Don. Just to follow up on what Barry was talking about statewide standards in the shoreline zone. Barry, I agree with you. I think, statewide standards, having a uniform statewide standards makes it easier for landowners and the managers who manage that land. The problem I have, Don, is some of these municipalities that have adopted statewide standards still have current other ordinances related to timber harvesting. I'll use 2 examples just from my experience. Town of Cumberland, which I am also their forester as well for the town. They are a statewide standards town in the shoreline zone, but they require a permit for any timber harvesting in Cumberland. It requires a harvest plan. So another example, I'm on the select board in New Gloucester. New Gloucester has a timber harvesting ordinance. If you ask the code officer in New Gloucester if they have a timber harvesting ordinance, they probably won't know what you're talking about, but it's there and it's on the books, and they are a statewide standards town. That ordinance was passed in 1986, Don, and it's still on the books. Which, if any, any harvest in New Gloucester would be violated if it was enforced, any timber harvest. So that I agree with you, Barry, on the statewide standards. It definitely makes it easier, but we still have a bunch of these ordinances. So the last question I'll leave with is, we have this state law that municipalities are supposed to follow, and I'm not picking on municipalities. Trust me, Rebecca, you know, I volunteer in New Gloucester. I'm on the select board. I was on the budget committee. I'm on everything, so I'm not picking on municipalities. But if we have this law that municipalities are supposed to follow before they adopt any forestry ordinances, why is it not working, and why is it not being enforced? So if we have a law, why is it not being enforced? I mean, we have a bunch of ordinances right now that were written in violation of that law. And is it up to the landowners and the foresters to challenge the municipality? I don't believe it. Anyway, that's it for that. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. Don Kleiner, you have the floor.
I never get a great tee up like that. Thank you so much. It seems to me there's a giant education piece missing here. And I mean, the planning board, select people, all of those, keep in mind, they're volunteers, they have a day job, they have families. How do we boil down some of this so that they can succinctly understand the impacts of what they're doing? I mean, I've been in natural resource stuff longer than I care to admit at this point, and it is frightening to me. Time and time again, people just don't know. I mean, to me, the lobster restrictions are a classic example of those guys are harvesting outside of the 3 miles. I can't see them. They don't exist. And that gets played out over and over again. How do we somehow raise that up on people's radar? And timber harvesting is a great one because it doesn't happen for a very long time, right? You have a really good first quarter and then not another one for 40 years. So it's easy to forget that that's a business someone's in. And can a recommendation be here that something be developed that's provided to those boards that kind of says, you know, you need to be aware of these sort of things and the impacts, and please keep these in mind. And oh, by the way, the two state agencies need to be talking off the same page here. And again, I'm not going to give that one up because I've seen that play out enough. There. Thanks for the tee up. I love it.
Thanks, Don. Michael, you have your hand up.
Well, I'd like to reinforce and support what Don just said with regards to education. I think that's key. That takes resources, that takes commitment, takes money, and it takes awareness that this is an important issue. I think there's the classic push-pull between, I know in a small town, is how, at what point does the town say that it's just not worth the effort of running a town, versus having the ability to influence and control things within your own community that grow out of a shared vision. Now, true, the shared vision may all be ignorant of other issues that it would be better off knowing about. But I think it's a tough problem to have a history of home rule where towns can in return for making the commitment to do all the things that is required of a municipality, they get to make choices for better or for worse. And I guess one of my concerns is that model shifting, and is it shifting for the better, or is it something that we should fight to retain and use better education as a way to support it?
Okay. Patty, you've got your hand up. And you're on mute. There you go.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank Rebecca and Michael and Barry for coming in this morning. And Michael, want to parrot what Tom Doak said. I hope you didn't feel put upon this morning. You were very brave. But I think just a quick question, had Rouseck discussed statewide standards, adopting statewide standards at all, and how did that conversation go?
What I recall from the time that this was being looked at, it was part of the larger project of bringing the entire ordinance into conformance with state guidelines. And the subject of timber harvesting, as it was presented by the DEP, was that it was a rather complex subject because there were multiple choices presented. You could choose this, you could choose that, and if that goes in, then a number of communities, then it becomes statewide, or you can, you can rely on the state. Can you rely on the state? Or you just go your own way and you retain local control. And I think that it just boiled down to, we got to tackle this, make a choice and move on. And, here we are a dozen years later with an unintended consequence that is coming to light.
Great, thank you. And I just also wanted to, Don Kleiner, you've been bringing up the, that education role, and if you look at the proposal that we're going to be discussing after the break, we're going to get much deeper into that, I think. But yeah, thank you guys for being on.
Rebecca, and then Barry, and then I think we'll go to break.
Thank you, Don. I just wanted to let everyone else know that Mike has been an absolute trooper for this. Yeah, he was very reluctant to find out what I was going to suck him into already, and he, thank you, graciously showed up. So please hold me, not him, accountable for anything that's going on, because I threw him into the hot seat, and he's such a trooper to take some time out of his day to do that, as are all municipal officials. But that's another story. But so thank you personally for me, Mike, for doing that. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome. It was not nearly as painful as I imagined when I got into bed last night. So thank you all for making it civil and polite and understanding. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. Barry, one last word.
Sure. Yeah, I just wanted to echo what Don and others have said about the importance of education and learning through this whole process for everyone involved. The towns, Maine Forest Service, landowners, town officials, and with the Maine Tree Foundation, we put a lot of work and effort and thought into doing that with the recent harvest at the Holt Research Forest. We had a webinar for townspeople. We had meetings pre-harvest, during harvest, and after harvest. We're doing new research now based on studying the physical effects in the forest and the wildlife. based on the harvest. So the research is ongoing, and that will be ongoing for quite a while. So I just want to say to the two town officials that are here now, I mean, we're available as a resource, happy to continue discussions with you, help arrange a meeting with the Maine Forest Service to come in and talk about it, so you don't have to just always hear me talking from the forestry perspective. Get some other voices in there too, but the whole forest, you know, we feel the Maine Tree Foundation feels very strongly about the value of the Holt, both as a research site and as a demonstration forest, and very happy to continue working with the town to, you know, evolve discussions and, you know, be a part of the community and see if we can maybe make things a little bit more friendly to forest stewardship.
All right, Paul, I said Barry's going to be last, but go ahead real quick.
Sorry, just one more comment, Don. And Patty, and for the other foresters in that, what I found, just a general comment, is that the municipalities that are actively engaged in managing municipal land, and I'll use example Falmouth, which is one of my clients, Cumberland, North Yarmouth, those municipalities that are actively engaged in managing town-owned land have a really good knowledge about forestry and these regulations and the ins and outs. So it has, I will say that, Patty, Project Canopy, you know, with towns getting management plans and actively managing their land has made a big difference for private landowners within those municipalities, including Falmouth. Falmouth is a great example. I mean, you've been there with me, Patty. I mean, they actively manage a lot of land. They're current tree farmers, you know, and they do all kinds of educational components. But having that knowledge within the town government has spilled out onto all the private landowners. So keep encouraging municipalities to actively manage their land because it makes a huge difference.
Okay, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Rebecca, for your presentation, and Michael, we really appreciate you coming on today. And if the town has any questions about timber harvesting in the shoreline zone or outside the shoreline zone or along the roads, we've got a district forester available to meet with the town at any time to talk about that. Before we jump into the next agenda item, I wanted to speak to the issue of statewide standards for timber harvesting and related activities in shoreland areas. Just want to clarify a few things. The first is that, as Michael described, there are three options for towns that regulate shoreline zoning. This is strictly for the timber harvesting portion of the shoreline zoning ordinance. They have three options. One, they can repeal the timber harvesting provisions in their existing shoreline zoning ordinance and cede all authority back to the Maine Forest Service. Option two is that the towns adopt our published rules into their shoreline zoning ordinance. And in those cases, we will assist the town through a memorandum of understanding in the administration and enforcement of the timber harvesting provisions. Towns that want to do something different from the statewide standards, more stringent, as they've done in, for example, in Arousik, those towns are considered option three, and they are on their own for enforcement and administration of the timber harvesting provisions. We've got well over 300 towns in the state now that have chosen option one or option two. Most of them have chosen option one, meaning we want to be rid of this. You guys take care of it. And we're well on our way to easily hitting 70–80% of all the towns in the state being option one or option two within the very near future. Now, the other thing is about what happens when we hit a certain number of towns that have adopted these either option one or option two. That's simply a trigger for those same statewide standards going into effect in the jurisdiction of the Land Use Planning Commission. They do not go into effect in all the towns that either have not acted or are option 3. Those towns remain on their own with their own ordinances. Any questions on that? Oh, Nancy.
Are there any towns that have done option 1 and option 2 on the shoreland, but then have a separate ordinance related to forest management outside the shoreline zone?
As I pointed out, we only become aware of local timber harvesting ordinances by chance. There are a few towns that we're aware of that do have timber harvesting ordinances, and they are option 1 or option 2 under statewide standards. The other thing I wanted to point out, I believe some people may think that we do not enforce the rules. We do. There have been numerous enforcement actions taken over the years since we've taken on statewide standards since 2005, I believe it was. So there's plenty of folks out there who will tell you that we're doing our job. Okay, if there's no other questions on statewide standards, we will move to a proposal that we are putting forward for the group to consider. And I want to just acknowledge that this is largely based on something that Tom Doak said at the end of the last meeting. So we tried to put it into a logical format and see what folks think. So the first piece is, and I'll go one by one if you want. We can, beat each one around. First one is to clarify in statute what constitutes a forestry ordinance that requires Maine Forest Service review. I've looked at the existing language in the law, and it jumps around from timber harvesting to harvesting, back to timber harvesting, and in the law and in our rules, it would probably be more better to go with timber harvesting activities, which includes timber harvesting, but also includes the associated construction of land management roads, skid trails, and so on. Does not include things like pesticides, pre-commercial work. It's strictly the operations that are necessary to conduct a timber harvest. And so we think that piece needs to be clarified in the law. So that's, simply taking where it says in the existing law, harvesting or timber harvesting, and changing it to timber harvesting activities. Heather.
So I think that there already is in statute a requirement that pesticide ordinances be reported to the Board of Pesticides Control. So I'm wondering if it's already in state statute, do you need to do this if the purpose is trying to clarify that you're not talking about pesticide ordinances? I mean, maybe there are other examples, but that seems to be the one that's come up in our meetings, and it's already dealt with in state law. So I'm not sure why that would need to be added.
We're not dealing with pesticides. That was my point.
I know. You were suggesting that you would clarify the approach to clarifying would be to state what it doesn't include, but it's already Board of Pesticide Control already.
No. What I'm saying is that we changed harvesting and timber harvesting to timber harvesting activities, which means timber harvesting, the construction and maintenance of roads used primarily for timber harvesting, and the mining of gravel used for the construction and maintenance of roads used primarily for timber harvesting, and other activities conducted to facilitate timber harvesting. My point in excluding pesticides was simply to say we don't even deal with that in this. Paul. and then Don Kleiner.
Don, the definition of timber harvesting is chapter 21, right?
Yeah, wait, it's in state law, actually.
Okay.
But yeah, it's carried over into our rules.
So there's 20, because there's timber harvesting and timber harvesting activities in the rule.
Right.
Are you saying clarify those two into one? Is that what you're thinking?
No, timber harvesting activities is more encompassing and covers
Okay.
all of the activities associated with timber harvesting.
Okay. Yep. Thank you.
Yep. Don Kleiner, you had your hand up?
I did, but my question just got answered. I was going to suggest we put that definition in statute someplace. If it exists, just reference it.
Yep. Paul, you still have your hand up. Okay, I'm going to move on to item 2, which is establish in statute a process where either a municipality certifies to Maine Forest Service that it's followed the process that's outlined in Title 12, Section 8869, subsection 8, or that Maine Forest Service certifies that a municipality has followed the process and the ordinance is approved. And that would be similar to what DEP does with shoreline zoning ordinances, where the town sends a copy of its ordinance to DEP for review, and DEP says, yep, it's good, and it goes into effect. So either way, we're kind of indifferent on this. Rebecca, and then Nancy, and then Tom.
Thanks, Don. I think key is to raise awareness. I think we've heard that pretty clearly. So I think that an option where the municipality submits that to the department, and therefore the department has the opportunity to engage and help inform that process so that it can be corrected is probably a better path forward.
So you're suggesting the latter?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. I think Nancy and then Tom.
Yeah, I think I just had my question answered, but I'm assuming we're looking to put one or the other in, not have both options.
That is correct.
So I agree with what Rebecca said.
Okay, Tom.
That was that. I had that same thought. It should be one or the other. And so, did I hear that we're kind of lining up on B? Was that what we're doing?
The two people have spoken previously, yes.
Okay, because I do think that makes more certainty for everybody, frankly. So, yeah.
Okay, Paul.
Don, sorry if my hand was up.
Yep.
I'm sorry, but I agree with what everybody said. I agree with the way Rebecca stated that too. B.
Okay. Heather.
Is the excuse me, is the opening clause necessary if we went with B? In other words, do we need established in statute?
We do need some statutory change in order for this to take effect. There has to be some legal authority for us to do this.
You can't just do, I mean, sounds like you.
It would have no legal effect.
Okay.
Let's see, Heather, your hand's still up. More questions?
Sorry. No.
Tom.
I wasn't gonna talk about that one, but I do think it just makes sense to clarify for everybody. It would be too bad to have someone go through an ordinance and then say, gee, you really didn't have to, or not go through it. And, there should be clarity about what an ordinance, when you have to do the consultation and when you don't. There is the existing, I'm assuming as part of 2B, there's a requirement already in the statute for the Bureau to maintain, and it says for informational purposes, a statewide listing of ordinances. So I'm assuming that 2B would also include something that says this is the list. so that anybody who wanted to know if there was an ordinance, an approved ordinance, it would be able to go to this site and say, okay, that's it. Is that your thinking?
I think that's a good idea, Tom, because, I know the law says we're supposed to keep a list, but obviously, we only know what we find out about. So this is one way to do that.
I just think that would be a real help to everybody, so that, that you can go there and say, okay, is there an ordinance in this town regulating timber harvesting or not? And that would be helpful. I mean, a lot of my members don't, they wouldn't necessarily know there was an ordinance. And it's not, maybe, it may not even be an onerous ordinance, but some of them are very simple. But they wouldn't necessarily know that it's even there. So I think that would be a real service. And also the date of it, so that that if there's one that's kind of a flag to a town that says, oops, our current one is not, we're thinking about this one, we need to make sure that the current version is up on the Forest Service website, things.
Thanks, Tom.
Yep.
Paul.
I concur with what Tom said. It would be great if there was a list. So we had an idea, and I think about the smaller municipalities, Don, for example, where their code officer is there, one Thursday a month, or the second Thursday and the fourth Thursday a month, and there's just not no fault of theirs. I mean, they're a small town, but it's hard to gain the information. You know what I mean?
Yep.
So if there was, and the clerks are usually, in most cases, aren't willing to answer questions related to those without the code officer. So if there was a place that you could turn and say, aha, there is an ordinance, so I need to talk to somebody, that would be great.
Don Kleiner.
Yeah, through all of this, Don, one of the differences that has come pretty clear, we're talking about forestry, and we need to, for these town officials, make it clear that we're not talking about development regulation, that's separate. And the other is, it occurs to me that a lot of this timber harvesting is not in a timber harvesting ordinances are not in a timber ordinance. They're in shoreland zoning. They're resource protection. So we need to encourage them to think a little more deeply than just say, oh, we don't have a timber ordinance, because in fact they do. They just call it something else. And I don't want them to run afoul of, just didn't think it through clearly.
Yeah. Yes. Totally agree. And that's partly why we're suggesting clarifying what in statute, what is a timber harvesting ordinance that requires review. Because we don't want to be in the development business. That's somebody else's job.
Well, to me, there's a bright line, and that's a whole different thing. And we're not talking about that, frankly. Yep. And let's say what we're not talking about.
Yep. Tom?
Hey, Don, as part of the notification process, when you send back the information back to a landowner or their agent, you'd be able to add that there's an ordinance in the town, correct? That wouldn't be a big lift with it.
It shouldn't be a big lift to do that
if
we know.
Keeping the list, it would be, because you've got the official list, so that would be another way to let people, landowners know when they file that notification. Oh, by the way, did you check there is an ordinance that you need to look at, so that we don't get crosswise that way.
Yep.
I think it would be simple to do. I can say that because I wouldn't have to do it.
Yeah, I haven't looked at our acknowledgement lately, because I haven't filed a notification myself for a while, but I believe that we do state that you need to pay attention to local ordinances, and you may be governed by some other things going on in the town or federal or whatever. But yeah, good idea. It
would be really helpful and a service, frankly, to the town, I think, to include that. Yeah.
Got it. Okay. Any other points on this one before we move on? Greg Foster.
Yeah, if a town simply puts into their ordinance that to do any timber harvesting, you're required to get a conditional use permit from a planning board, would this address that?
Probably not, because we're looking at the standards that the town would apply, not specifically whether they require a permit.
Then the planning board could maybe issue their own kind of standards to the property owner. If they come to the planning board and they dictated some kind of way you're limited in your timber harvesting.
Well, yeah, you're right. They could, but they would have to be guided by their ordinances, and they could not be arbitrary and capricious in their application of the permit requirement.
Yeah.
And hopefully, if we set this up correctly before then, they'd be in consultation with us so that we could talk through that process with them.
Yeah, that would be good. Thanks.
Rebecca.
Yeah, I'd like to see if we're going to put this into statute rather than do like some sort of outreach, then I'd like to see that there are guarantees within the department that there's going to be an education and support piece in conjunction with that submission. So where those ordinances don't ally, where they have maybe need to be repealed, that there's going to be full support from the department for that too, so that it is we need this and we're here to help kind of approach, as opposed to you need to do this and now you're out of compliance and this is the implications for your community as well.
Thank you. Tom, you got your hand up, and then Greg again.
I was kind of following up on Greg's question because I'm familiar with a town that had an ordinance that you must get a permit from the code enforcement officer. It had no standards. This may not be legal enough, but it had absolutely no standard. Just said you have to get a permit from the code enforcement officer. I contacted the code enforcement officer. He sent me back a note that says you have to comply with all state laws. Here's your permit. You must comply with all state laws. But there was no ordinance to back that up. So I think you might want to look at the idea of a notification as part of timber harvesting. You may want to. I mean, again, we're trying to keep landowners and municipalities from missing each other here. And if I have to consult with the municipality, it seems like that should be included in the ordinance part. Because I think you could have a situation. You're suggesting that if it said a permit, what could possibly be the standards if there were no standards in an ordinance other than you have to get a permit? That's, could a municipality then say, here, we want you to use the point system on all timber harvesting? I don't know, but we want to avoid those situations anyway where there's miscommunication.
Gonna have to ponder that one, because that's really a ministerial function of the municipality, and maybe give us opportunity to comment, but I'm not sure we're going to get into commenting on every permit for timber harvesting. Greg, you had your hand.
Could you could you then create? I mean, I think Greg was asking the interesting question. Could a municipality say you have to get a permit, and then somehow put some standards, requirements on that without having gone through a review? I don't know. Maybe there's a simple answer to that.
Yeah, I don't have a good answer for that. I'm going to give Greg the floor and then to Rebecca.
Yeah, I actually didn't mean to have my hand up, but
okay.
But I have experience with that, and it wasn't pleasant in terms of a conditional use permit and the planning board people trying to. They actually made things worse, as it turned out. That's it.
Thanks, Rebecca.
Thanks. I just want to clarify for Tom that you can require a permit for activity, but not necessarily regulate that activity. it's a notification process that comes in. So yeah, if it goes before planning board, you might have a deeper interrogation, which may be painful because people are trying to figure out maybe why, because they're not getting those applications. But a permit for activity is very different than regulating that activity, and one requires you to have a set of standards rather than you requiring a permit. That's a question within. They're two completely different things, basically.
Don, can I
Yes.
ask a quick question?
Yep.
So is there a distinction that needs to be made somehow that says, that I understand that, if it's like the harvest notification, I have to notify the town. Right now I have to notify the Maine Forest Service. That's a requirement. It is not a permit, it's simply a notification requirement. Does that mean, Rebecca, that a municipality could require a permit and say X amount of money or whatever, but they'd have to have an ordinance if they put conditions on that permit? Is that what you're suggesting?
Yes, essentially. So you take, for instance, fireworks permits. There's a state level that, there's a notification process that happens. You can apply through the state level for that town gets notified. But if you do it locally and apply for that permit, there's a different fee structure than at the state level, but also there's a different set of standards only because, only for wind, for instance. Like it might, your region might be a specific weather pattern as identified on the state scale, but not so locally. So often that is what the trigger for the local permit is. So any sort of conditions would have to be established and acceptable and defensible behind that. But as far as requiring a permit and requiring a fee for an activity, that is entirely separate from whether or not the standards, or whether there was an application or requirement of standards within that, I believe.
Okay.
Don Kleiner, and then I think we need to move on to the next item.
Just a observation, as a guy who waddles out back with his chainsaw to cut his firewood, I didn't know I needed a permit from my town to do that. Who was going to tell me? Where is that information communicated?
And
Not that the Union stormtroopers are going to show up to put sand in my chainsaw, but frankly, where is that? And how is that communicated? And going back to my education piece, if I owned 100 acres and I hired a forester, I wouldn't know I'm supposed to have a permit from the town. Where is that requirement?
Don, that is kind of the same thing as almost everything else at the municipal level. Whether or not I'm putting up a shed and require a permit for a shed or don't depends upon where I am and depends upon the town ordinances for that. So essentially going to your town office is the only way in which those, or reading your annual report in terms of that. Often they're published, the ordinances are published, but again, it varies very much from town to town. And as far as enforcement goes, you hit the golden question. Like, you can have all the rules that you want, unless there is some sort of mechanism for enforcement and someone to do that enforcement. That's all it is. It's just words on paper.
All right, Paul, last word. Then we got to move on.
Yeah, just really quickly, 2 comments. Rebecca, I agree with you about the educational component. Don, I just sent an email with a CEO who can't understand why they're not in statewide standards, so I just sent that to Tom Gilbert today.
Thank you.
Yeah. So education, to the permit, to Don's point, Don, that's kind of what we deal with as foresters all the time, is trying to figure out if we've not violated any local ordinances when we're harvesting wood. I can tell you, when I started this process, my concern was and I won't name the municipality, but when you're paying $1,000 for a permit to cut wood, it gets a little expensive, especially when you're cleaning up storm damage. So those were my concerns originally, is $1,000 to clean up storm damage on a landowner's property. The wood wasn't worth $1,000. Anyway, those are my concerns. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We're going to move on to point 3, which is to establish a new deadline for municipalities with current forestry ordinances, regardless of when they adopted them or whether they followed the process, to make all their definitions consistent with definitions in state law or Maine Forest Service rule by a date certain. And there was that provision in the 1999 law. And frankly, we have no way of knowing whether towns did that. The only way we found out about a few is when somebody complained about a particular ordinance, and we would look at the ordinance and some of the definitions, one town in particular defined a clear cut as anything that removed more than 35% of the volume on 1 acre. And so you got to shake your head over those. But anyway, give towns another chance to come up to speed on their definitions and set a deadline for it. Again, this would be part and parcel of the towns, giving them the grace period to fess up.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Rebecca.
Can I just advocate that we change the language from fess up, just because these folks did things in the spirit of being fully appropriate, and there's no sneakiness. They really are just trying to do the right thing.
Yep.
Maybe they didn't do it the right way, and I think that we can all pretty much agree that communication was not the greatest at that point in time. So I think giving them another opportunity and supporting them in that future is definitely what we want to be looking at.
I would like to speak in defense of Jeff Herman. He did do some outreach back in the day.
From what I understand, I've never met Jeff, but he'd probably appreciate that.
Nancy.
This is probably a question for Rebecca, but just curious whether you think that date is a reasonable date, knowing the timeline on what towns work on.
Yeah, so I think it actually is probably going to have to be 2 years out. I think it's a challenge to get an ordinance passed in many of these small communities. You need to have it before the town meeting, or else you need to have the resources to call a special town meeting. And then a special town meeting, you're not likely to get a lot of turnout. And I think if we want to maximize education piece, we should at least give it a couple of cycles to make sure it goes before the town.
Yeah, I agree. I wasn't thinking that far out, but you're right. If anything happens in the coming legislative session, then 2025 would be the earliest. And I'll try to change my language. Okay, no other comments on that? Number 4. Municipalities with current ordinances adopted on or after September 1st, 1990 that have not followed the process. Again, we can adjust the dates, but they have until a time certain to submit the ordinances to Maine Forest Service for review and comment, and otherwise follow the process, and then complete it by a date certain. And if they don't, then those ordinances are no longer in effect. Tom Doak.
John, what's the significance of the September 1st of 1990?
That was when the law originally took effect.
Was it 90 or 99?
Actually, it's in the law that it says that, let me see here. If you go to section 8, subsection, right there in subsection 8, it says municipal timber harvesting ordinances adopted before September 1st, 1990 must meet the standard of compliance with definitions no later than January 1st, 2001. So they had, they were given basically 10 years to bring their ordinances into compliance. So in this case, we would just adopt or change the extend the deadline for doing that.
So the difference between 3 and 4 is 3 deals with definitions. Is that it? And 4 deals with all the other components?
Correct. That's correct.
So and that's the assumption that any ordinance, so are there ordinances that wouldn't be affected by either A or 3 or 4?
Only if the town has consulted previously with the Maine Forest Service on the adoption of its ordinance.
Right. Those are those that are in compliance now.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
But those that are, or a grandfathered one that from before 1990 that hasn't been amended, is that it?
They would still be grandfathered, but this would give them the opportunity to report the existence of the ordinance to the Maine Forest Service so we could include it on the list.
So we would still have potentially some ordinances that are don't have consistent definitions and have not gone through a process. Those, right? Unless there could be some out there somewhere.
Yep.
Is that right?
Yep.
Do we want to clean this all up at once and not have to do this again? I mean, is there a downside to saying to the towns that have an ordinance, you know, get them through the, we'll certify it, so then you don't have to worry about you know, challenges and things like that? Is it? I mean, this is 30 years after that deadline. It seems to me that some ordinance, there might be some that's more than 30 years, some that are more than 30 years old, but probably not a whole lot. And I'm wondering if we ought to just clean this all up at once. You know, and just say, you know, we know the ones that are in compliance already. You've got those lists. You can say these people don't need to do anything. Anybody else that has this, come forward, get your definitions right, and if you haven't gone through a consultation, do it. You can do whatever you want, but follow the process and let's get everything legally adopted and go forward. Doesn't that make sense? And I don't know if there's a problem here or not. That's what I don't know. I mean, there may be no towns that fit that situation. I don't know.
Nancy, and then Heather, and then Rebecca.
Yeah, I was wondering whether in that one, and maybe it's implied, I'm not sure, but whether or not, you know, it has to be reviewed by Maine Forest Service, but do we need to tack on something that then says they have until such and such a date to get it in compliance with state law? Because I think that's maybe what's missing right there. And sort of going back to the same comment that Rebecca made, revisions would have to go through town meeting to get approved by folks. So right. I wonder if we need to add that in.
I got to think about that, how to structure that. Basically, you know, the goal is to, so backing up, maybe it's any municipality that has a current ordinance that regulates timber harvesting, regardless of the date of adoption, submits it to the Maine Forest Service for review and comment, and then the town has the opportunity to decide whether to amend that ordinance, keep it as it is, or repeal it by, you know, by some time certain off in the future. Okay, Heather.
Yeah, I guess if there is going to be new language in statute, I think that the approach from the department needs to be general to the communities. Maybe some of these municipalities already have policies that we're not aware of. Maybe some are fully in compliance, maybe some are out of compliance, but I feel like general outreach comprehensively is good and in a really positive, respectful manner. I feel like the whole the that preceded this discussion in the legislative session was antagonistic, and I think the even the title that's applied to the stakeholders group of the right to forestry, I think is disrespectful of the communities that have been thoughtful about their processes. So I just feel like the whole energy needs to be, more carrot than stick.
Thank you. Paul.
Thanks, Don. To Tom's point, Tom, I'll just give you an example. I know you own a bunch of land in New Gloucester, and in 1986, and it's on the website, Tom, if you want to look at it. In 1986, an ordinance was passed, a timber harvesting ordinance. Several of the conditions, harvesting operations shall be conducted in such a manner that a well-distributed stand of trees is retained. Pretty open. Harvesting activity shall not create single openings greater than 7,500 square feet in the canopy. Okay, so that's one, Don, that is not being enforced. Nobody knows about it, but it's on the books. Okay, and I'm the liaison to the LMPC in town. Okay, from the select board. So these are out there, Tom, and you harvest wood in New Gloucester. So how does that make any sense to an order? And I'm not disrespecting the community because that I serve that community, but I'm also going to take the side of the landowner here, who provides a tremendous amount of benefit to the community, both in recreational, water quality, aesthetics, carbon sequestration, all of that. All of those things are provided to the municipality. They ought to at least get the respect to be able to manage their timber. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. Any other comments on this before we move on to 5? Oh, Rebecca.
Yeah, I'd just like to thank Heather in terms of the tone, because I think it's really important that we get operators involved in this outreach effort and involved in the education piece. That is what we have under the right to farm. We have the farmers that are involved in that education piece, and understanding where those resources are and where those experts are within your community, I think is also key. So I think maybe making sure that we know where there are additional community resources, even beyond the department where those experts exist, is really important. And getting back to Paul's point, yep, absolutely agree that it doesn't make any sense and is probably not enforceable, but it's probably also not looked at. And I think that again, we need to have some folks that actually work within this scope to have some skin in that game as well. And we have, just to revisit, we actually have, municipalities have recognized the importance of the forest industry, which is why we have the tree growth tax abatement now, which is a significant amount of revenue that towns give up in order to make sure that forestry can continue to happen and that those lands are protected from development. And then it's a significant amount of money.
Tom Doak, last word.
Yeah, my interest in this is not to be critical of municipalities or anything. It's just clear that there are a bunch of things that have not gone as anticipated here, and a municipality has an absolute right under the law to develop the standards, but they are obligated to follow a process, and even notify the landowners of directly of that are affected. And so let's figure out how to get this so that these are legally adopted ordinances. No landowner wants to go back and try to bring the town to court over, you can't, you've done this wrong, and nobody's even suggesting that. So let's figure out a way to clean all this up. And it seems like it makes sense to me that we just say, you submit all your ordinances. If the definitions have to, all definitions of all ordinances must be the same under law, right? That's it. And then you theoretically, you don't have to go through the consultation process if your ordinance existed in 1990 and you haven't amended it since 99. Other than that, everybody else should go through so that I don't like to be in a position as a landowner to say there's an ordinance, but like in New Gloucester, we are the biggest landowner of the town of Gloucester. I'm obligated to comply with the law. I want to comply with the law. I don't want to hear Paul say to me, well, there's an ordinance there, but you can go ignore it. I have an obligation as a landowner to adhere to the laws. I think I am, but I want to get those laws that aren't enforceable out of the way, so we don't have an impediment to those landowners. I don't want to be breaking the law. I don't think I am. I hope I'm not, but I don't want to be in that position. So let's get this all figured out. There's no hostility here. It's just let's get back to what we had, which I think will work if we just can get it implemented correctly, and the help to the municipalities to make it happen. So I'll get off my soapbox.
Thanks, Tom. We're going to move on to number 5 because it's 11:20 and we do promise to get you out of here by noon. Establish in law the requirement that any ordinance restricting timber harvesting activities must be consistent with policies adopted in a state certified comprehensive plan. Rebecca.
Forgive me if I'm wrong, but state certified comprehensive plans is already in statute and was adopted, I believe, when there was a state planning office. There is no longer a state planning office. And I just want to make sure that we understand that there are communities that have DEP requirements as well as federal requirements that intersect with this, and that there is this crossover between those, because regulated communities have to have restrictive timber harvesting in certain areas, or they need tools to be able to say that.
Understood. This is to ensure that the towns that have comprehensive plans that have been certified by the state, they have policies in place in those plans that address their concerns about timber harvesting. So there's a basis in there's a legal basis for the ordinance to exist in the town. And I've been to a fair number of planners workshops because I used to be a town planner back in the day, and including going to the Lincoln Institute. And the one thing that they kept pointing out was if you've got an ordinance, it must be consistent with the comprehensive plan. So this is just a reminder that you got to have that linkage between comp plans and the ordinance. Nancy.
So I just wanted to, because I don't know very much about comprehensive plans and what it means for ordinances. So what you're saying is a town that has a comprehensive plan that's guiding what already should be guiding what their ordinances say. So this is not adding another layer of restrictions on what a town can do.
Correct. It's simply that in order to justify the existence of the ordinance, it's got to be addressed in the plan. And every state agency has a chance to review these draft comprehensive plans before they are adopted by the town. And we've had plenty of opportunity over the years to comment on draft plans. Rebecca?
Don, can you tell me what the resource would be for communities? Because comprehensive plans are now being added to in a number of different ways from a number of different state agencies, and there isn't a centralized place to be submitting those plans at this point in time. So what can you also clarify what the path is for those communities to do this, because they are adhering to that state requirement. So I think that there's been a very well identified vacuum of state support within the comprehensive plan process. Lots of requirements, no support.
My understanding is when we get a plan, the draft plan comes to us from the Land Use Planning Commission. I can't remember the name of the office, but their Office of Community. I'm sorry, I don't remember their name, but somebody upstairs works on comp planning, and they send out the draft plans to all of the affected agencies for review, and then we comment back to the agency, to LUPC on the draft plan, and most of the time our comments are, yep, it's fine, or we have concerns about a particular issue, or they didn't mention something. And then the LUPC staff combine all the comments from the agency, send that back to the town, and then the town proceeds to go through the adoption process. Now, how many people they have doing that, I don't know. But I do know that I've reviewed dozens and dozens of plans over the years.
It's the community guided planning and zoning in LUPC.
Paul, you had your hand up.
Yeah, Don, we just went through it in New Gloucester. Municipal Planning Assistant Program under your Department of Agriculture, Conservation, and Forestry website. Our contact was Tom Maraglio,
Yep.
who helped us, guided us through the comprehensive plan process. Ours actually came back with comments, so we're working on the comments right now that came back in New Gloucester. But Tom was a big benefit in coordinating the comments between the different agencies and then giving us guidance on compliance with those comments. And in our case, I can tell you, Rebecca, from our case, many of the comments were related to our organizational structure of the comprehensive plan and not the information that was provided in it. It was the way that we presented it. So Tom helped us with that quite a bit. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. Okay, moving on to the big one, number 6, education and outreach. And this is where I'm getting back to something Rebecca said earlier, is to work with MMA to coordinate on an outreach effort to all towns to inform them what the law is, or whatever it ends up being, via a newsletter, where we know that a town has a forestry ordinance, regardless of when they adopted it, to reach out to those towns and help them work through the process if they want to, and basically doing the information piece that folks, you all have been speaking to quite a bit through this process. We've never turned a town down for help. Anytime a town reaches out to us, we're happy to work with them. I mean, I've personally worked with some towns because they're just, staff have been overwhelmed. So, but at somebody, the town's going to get an answer to its questions from somebody at the Maine Forest Service. Rebecca.
Thanks, Don. I think this is key. I'd love to move it up to number 1.
Yep.
But I also think that we have industry stakeholders that can help with this lift and maybe should be identified in that, because I think that they're the ones that can speak to that with most passion and understanding of the mechanics, maybe help with that lift on the department end as well. But, we just had that conversation with Main Tree and understanding that they have a whole bank of education pieces that might be available. I really think that we should try to get as many folks in this mix as we can, and really do a concerted, joined up effort to do this outreach, because I think that alleviates 90% of the issues that we've heard. Ordinances can be, they can be amended, they can be corrected, and they just need folks to come in and have that conversation. And yes, that whole process is super laborious, but we're also talking on scale, like a real small number of towns compared to the number of towns that are in the state. So I think if we invested as much of our effort into this section, we could alleviate almost everything else.
Mm-hmm. Yep. I'm going to go Don Kleiner, and then Nancy, and then Paul.
Just real quick, the way it's written, Don, it seems sort of closed-ended to me. And I think I'd like this to be a little more ongoing than we're going to do this once or twice. I mean, again, I go back to town officials are volunteers. They have lives. You're not going to hit them in one newsletter.
Yep.
I appreciate you thinking that you're that effective, but you're not. Let's make a little bit longer term plan. And I like the more partners idea, Rebecca. That's a reasonable thought. We've got the woodland owners, we've got the Forest Products Council, we've got some people here we can enlist in this effort. That all makes sense, but I don't want this to be a one and done and we did that and walk away, because it's going to take longer than that.
Yep, I hear you on that. Nancy.
Yes, just a clarifying question. My assumption that this section is not, everything above that is potentially going into revising the statutes. This is outside of that, I'm assuming?
Correct.
Okay.
Although I'm not above directing a department in statute. Wouldn't be the first time I was involved in one of those.
You don't want to do that, Don, because then we'd have to put a fiscal note on it.
Don, I actually support that, and both Dons actually. And I think that, supporting a fiscal note, while it might be politically unpalatable, I think at the same time, we actually need to invest resources where we know there has been a lack of resources that has led to this issue to begin with. So I think we're all in making sure that the department has what it needs. And if we want to make this a long-term relationship building piece, then we need to invest in that education. And that might mean that we need to look at, how can we support the department, have a permanent education spot that really supported, everything from woodland owners to municipal officials and help with that lift.
Yeah, I would concur. I'm not afraid of a fiscal note on this.
MMA has also done this within the Department of Environmental Protection, because we've dealt with this on the municipal level so much, with it falling down onto people that are really displaced because the department doesn't have resources. So supporting a fiscal note and talking about the importance because of that lift from the municipal level, I think is absolutely something that we should consider, and not just be concerned because there's a fiscal note tied to something. Especially if we all agree that these are key pieces to carrying forward.
Okay. Paul.
No, I agree, Don. I was going to ask Rebecca if MMA had staff that could work on. I'm just kidding, Rebecca. I'm just kidding.
Sure.
Yeah. No, I know. All right. So, but I would like in this educational process, Don, for the volunteers, when we work in the municipalities, a go-to place on your website for municipalities would be great. On your website. Yep,
I hear you.
Okay, that's just the big thing. We did this, Rebecca, with the comprehensive plan process. So, if we had something on the Maine Forest Service website, a section for municipalities, even to define timber harvesting, all these things that we talk about to help with that process, and then all the context, that would be great.
Yeah, we have a cities and towns page, but it could definitely be improved. Just looking at it real quick. Yep, very good suggestion. Any other comments on this?
I just wanted to make a request, I guess, of Don Kleiner. So if, or anybody, think about how you would word your comment about, not just a closed effort, but a continuous effort. How would you word that in this section? Just think about that and send that in or something.
Yep, I can send it to you, Patty.
Thank you.
At least my best thought.
Yep, that's all we ask.
Any other comments? Paul.
Just one more, Don, I swear. back when I worked at the department, we did municipal training on tree
Yep.
growth, and the Maine Forest Service staff did a bunch of that training for municipal officials. Is that still go on?
Every once in a while we do it. I used to go and present to MMA
Right.
on a regular basis, and then was told, okay, that's enough of that. But happy to go back anytime to talk to MMA about that stuff. Greg Foster, real quick.
Yeah, I assume town planners, a lot of towns have their own town planners, and they must go through training and workshops, and certainly that's an avenue to get information to them about forest ordinances. That's it.
Yep, thank you. I have to admit ignorance on what training they go to, but yeah, probably the APA. Rebecca?
Yeah, town planners are kind of a more specialized group, more professional entity, and there's not a ton of them. It's mostly, volunteer planning boards, and we provide planning board education here too, which may have been what you were brought in on. I'm not sure, Don, but
No, I speak at the MMA annual meeting or the convention.
Which unfortunately we haven't had in 2 years. But yeah, those are always opportunities.
You can invite me back anytime to talk about tree growth, especially. They love it.
I'm gonna do that. I'll do that next time, and I hope that we have it in person because we've just been doing the Zoom thing. But I do think that that's also, because we have municipal officials that before were maybe technologically not inclined, Zoom has become a thing of the municipal world. Not necessarily Teams. You'd probably run into a lot of issue with Teams, but even just holding annual or monthly, talk to your forester things through Zoom. We're happy to promote that stuff. We're happy to send those opportunities out. We have our own list. Those are, that resource already is definitely here in terms of both, the outreach and the need for improvement or even submission. Those are things that we can do and send out to our membership that are real low barrier.
Okay. Tom Doak.
We own land in about 10% of all municipalities in the state now. And I would commit to Rebecca, I can send you a list of all the towns we own land in, and I'd be happy to come to any town that we own land in and introduce myself and talk about the law and talk about forest management and be, and say, you're welcome to call us. I think we're considered a pretty responsible landowner, and but I'm happy to talk with town officials in any of those towns, and I'll send you a list of all the towns where we own land, so that if there's somebody wants some help or just a conversation, I will come and meet with them or do it on Zoom or whatever works for them. So I'll send you that list.
That would
Thanks,
be great.
Tom.
Yeah,
awesome.
Great. We can do fireside chats in January before the legislation.
Yeah, let's just have them
via Zoom.
We can actually find something we could agree on. This would be a shift because Jeff Herman and I never could get to that point. So Jeff is a legend. Just so you know.
This is it. So he's a legend. That may mean that I'm subpar if I'm agreeing with you.
No,
maybe that, that's what I should maybe consider.
Just don't believe anything he tells you about me. That's all. So.
Ditto here.
Yeah, ditto. Well, that's ditto about everybody. Yeah.
Thank you all. We've covered the big list. There's some issues that we didn't talk about. I just want to touch on them briefly because they do affect this discussion. I'm not sure how we address them, except for number 7, which is distinguish timber harvesting activities from clearing for development. And I think that's really the key in all of this. Is a lot of what's been going on in southern and central Maine has been clearing for development, and it's not timber harvesting per se. So if there's a way to structure the law to make clear that, to differentiate between this development clearing that goes on and actual timber harvesting that has a purpose forest management purpose, I personally, I think that would be a good thing. And I believe it is the state of South Carolina that has some kind of recapture provision in their right to practice law, so that towns don't, they don't get caught out by the development clearing, that they can actually go back and enforce things. And we have kind of a recapture provision in the statewide standards for timber harvesting in shoreland areas, where if a change of land use happens within a certain amount of time after a timber harvest, and then the retroactively the whatever the town's development clearing standards are apply, and not our rules. Rebecca, hand up.
Yeah, I was just thinking that from the municipal level, even within the planning board, that understanding this is another key education piece. Understanding that difference is important, because the neighbor doesn't know that is timber harvest activity versus somebody that's coming in and doing development or clear cutting. What they're concerned about is there's, suddenly a massive swath of trees. So there's this public education piece, I think, that this bleeds into and might need to be honed out. I don't know that statute, that's not where neighbors go to find out what's going on. Yep. They see trees dropping. So I think this is a public education piece versus a statute piece. And maybe there needs to, be some sort of fee program in terms of that, what you were just talking about, the recapture provisions. I know where communities have had these issues with egregious clear cutting in the shoreline zoning, it has been the department being able to be that partner that has made the difference, significant difference, in that community's ability to deal with that abatement. So I think that that's key as well. But my understanding is that already exists. So we really got to work on that public education piece so that the neighbor knows the difference between the two as well.
Yep. Heather and then Nancy.
I was just thinking along those lines, is there a need to do specific education around timber harvesting or tree removal for reclaiming agricultural lands? Because that is certainly something that, is happening and is called for as we try to achieve the goals of the Maine Won't Wait climate action plan, just producing a lot more food in state, putting a lot more land into agricultural production. So I just wonder, maybe there's already a regulation around that, but I think that that's just another important thing for us to be thinking about as we move forward with the climate action plan.
Yeah, we worked with the ag folks a few years ago on this specific issue about clearing for agricultural use, and they incorporated some recommendations into whatever document they share with folks who are interested in doing ag conversion. Nancy?
Yeah, I just had a quick question about the roads. I'm assuming that the issue isn't so much weight because the roads already have weight limits on them. It's more of wear and tear on the roads and noise. Is that usually what the big concerns are in municipalities?
That's a question for Rebecca. Yep.
Nancy, the biggest complaint we get is the spring posting of roads. A lot of these roads are abysmal even in the summer, but they're old carriage roads, and it's the spring posting. You get a lot of pressure from residents that want the roads posted because they can't get even their Subarus down some of these roads to their house. And there's forestry practice that's going on. So that the posting of roads is a huge issue. And it's the municipal official that's caught in between both the industry and the resident with regard to this. And they're the ones that are also paying for the repair of it. I think it's unpalatable, even though it's possible for folks to, put a bond on forestry operations to go into these places. That is possible, but I think it's also, the last thing I think that municipal officials want to do. I don't know, probably Tom could speak to whether or not that's actually happening, but I know that is a tool. And rather than do that, just post the roads. They wait till it, it at least dries out so it's passable. But it causes issues every single year.
Yeah, Don Kleiner and then Dana. You're on mute, Don.
We touched on a broader public education piece here that I don't think your current bullets capture. And again, that will require some rethinking at the department on how that might best be done. I'm not familiar enough with your structure to go, this is the person, or this is the avenue. But I would ask the department to give some thought on how that works, because the other thing I'm cognizant of is our rural communities just changed a whole bunch. And we got a whole bunch of new people that we need to explain how it is we live. And it's not going to be easy, and it's going to take some time. That feller bunch of fires up at 11 p.m. because they got to have a load to the mill at 4. There's going to be problems.
Yep. Dana.
Thanks, Don. I'll just say with respect to the posting of roads, I worked closely with Rebecca and the Transportation Committee a couple of years ago on this and with the Maine Department of Transportation. So I'd probably say let's keep the roads situation out of the purview of this group for the time being. It really is a transportation related, but it is related, but there are so many other industries that are also impacted. And I think we struck a balance and a path forward over in the Transportation Committee a couple of years ago, and I would probably prefer we keep it there for the time being. I don't know if Rebecca disagrees, but I think that's where we're at.
Yep.
We're in full agreement, Dana.
Yeah, and I would suggest that 8, 9, and 10 dealing with fees, lawsuits, and time of day issues again are they're worthy of discussion, but for the purposes of this group, maybe it just needs to get punted off to a future process, unless I hear strong objections. Hearing none, it's 11:45. I'd like to go and see if there's anybody out there who wishes to offer public comment. If you would, please raise your hand and Rondi will let you in. Going once, going twice. Okay, seeing none. The next meeting is November 30th. And that will be the last meeting of this group before we have to submit a report to our oversight committee. And so in the intervening month, we intend to draft up something that looks more like a report. It would be based on this page that you all received earlier and which we've discussed today. And we'll include all the other the nice appendixes like what the current law is and the enabling legislation and all that. And hopefully get that out to you, give you plenty of time to review it before the meeting. And the next meeting would be your chance to provide additional comment and editorial support. And then we're done. Okay. Any other questions or comments? Seeing none, thank you all very much for your time today. And once again, we will be done before noon.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Have a great day, everybody.
Bye-bye.